So, let's get started by the collapse of the Soviet Union. I wanted to ask you, how was it look like for Russians after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
It looks terrible. When the Soviet Union fell apart, there was no real plan as to what to do about the constituent republics. There were 15 republics in this union of Soviet socialist republics, and they were sort of let drift off. The ironic thing is that President George H.W. Bush favored them kind of staying together, hang in there together and figure out how you're going to resolve all this stuff. But no, it was sort of simultaneous. And as Gorbachev left the scene, Yeltsin came in. Now, Yeltsin was poison for Russia. He hobnobbed with Wall Street, with the so-called Harvard boys, and with the rich people in Washington, and plundered the Russian economy, sold off the state assets at a minimum price. The result was, and not many people know this, but if memory serves, between 1991 and 1995, during those Yeltsin years, the expectant age of death among Russian males went from 63 years old to 57 years old. Now, where do I get that figure? From the World Bank, okay? It's valid, it's authentic. I know of no other case where a country like Russia would suffer this kind of, 6 years down from 63 to 57 years old when you expect it to die? In 4 years, people were dying. People were hungering in the street, but other people would get really, really wealthy. Those are what we call the oligarchs. Some of them were Russian, some of them were Ukrainian. A lot of them were from Harvard, Columbia, and Washington, D.C. So, point of my remarks here is that in answer to your question, when the Soviet Union fell apart, it was a very bad thing for the Russian people. Now, Putin has been quoted as saying one of the worst catastrophes in history has been the falling apart of the Soviet Union. Well, he's not saying that he wants, like the Soviet leaders, he wants to take over the world or even just Europe. He's not saying that. He's saying explicitly that this left tens of millions of Russians outside of the Russian Federation to fend for themselves. And long story short, we get to Ukraine, we could see how that went. They tried to fend for themselves, being maybe 40% of the Ukrainian population. When the West came in, the U.S. particularly, staged a coup in Kiev in February 2014 and marginalized the Russian-speaking population, and worst of all said, let's join NATO, a direct threat, an existential threat to how Putin and the Russian leaders look at the danger from the West.
Got it. I wanted to know, because we see a drastic change in Putin's vision since he took power to the early days to present time. Why he changed his vision? Because his vision is so nationalist. It's all about nationalism. Why he changed his vision toward West?
His reason for what?
For changing his vision toward West.
His reason for, I'm not hearing the last word.
Toward West.
For the West? Toward the West?
Yeah, toward the West.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't Putin's decision. He tried to reach out to the West. He tried to join NATO. He bought into the idea of George H.W. Bush that there could be a Europe whole and free from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Now, he was turned down. Why was he turned down? Well, the short answer is that unless you have an enemy as believable as the Russian enemy has been made out to be, then you can't produce and you cannot sell arms, and then you can't get rich like our oligarchs. Now, I just saw a figure indicating that one of our oligarchs is making 15,000 times as much as the normal worker in that establishment. That's egregious. That's obscene in my view. But there are people making a lot of money, and most of the people in the United States are not making a lot of money, but are beginning to suffer almost as badly as the Russians did in the 90s under Yeltsin, who was supported by the West. I mean, it was very lucrative business to plunder the old Soviet economy. And when he was in danger of not being reelected in 1996, guess what we did? We, the United States, not me. The IMF, the World Bank, they all jumped in and gave his campaign all kinds of money, and we gave him all kinds of advisors. He was reelected after really falling really short at the polls. And the cover of Time magazine shows Yeltsin with an American flag saying, "Well, we did it. We won again." What I'd like to make clear is that Vladimir Putin was there, okay? He watched all this. It is nothing short of a miracle that Yeltsin himself appointed Putin to take his place. Now, this is guesswork in terms of human nature, but I kind of think that Yeltsin felt very, very guilty of what he had done to his fatherland or his motherland, and decided, well, this is a bright guy. If anybody has any hope of undoing the damage that I, Yeltsin, did, it's Putin, so let him be president. That's the way I guess it worked out. I don't know any other reason why Yeltsin, the totally corrupt person, the drunk that he was, would make the right decision in this one instance, and I do consider it a right decision.
I see. And how about the Putin's vision? He changed his vision based on what? Because he came after Yeltsin. He tried to negotiate with the West. He tried to join NATO. In all his attempts, he failed. He couldn't join NATO. He couldn't negotiate.
Yeah, well, when you say in all these attempts he failed, well, if you look at it the other way, he tried, but it wasn't his fault that he failed. Let me give you an example here. In 2013, there was a false flag chemical attack outside of Damascus in Syria. False flag because it wasn't the Syrian government, as our Secretary of State, John Kerry, claimed. It was people that had brought this sarin gas in from Turkey. These were the insurgents. They were blamed. The attacks were blamed on the Syrian government, and all of the so-called neoconservatives wanted Obama to start another war, this time with Syria. Look what they did. The Syrians had poisoned all those people just outside of Damascus. Now, Obama was a little bit smarter than he had been way back when he was elected, and he didn't want to start another war. Every one of his advisors says you have to. That was a red line. You've got to start this war. We got these Tomahawk missiles. They're ready to fire. We can take out the Syrian government. You got to do it. What happened? Well, by chance, by coincidence, Obama was due up in St. Petersburg for an economic summit. And so he met with Mr. Putin at the time. And what Putin told him is, I know, and I applaud your not wanting to start another war. I've got a solution for you. Now, Obama was alone. He didn't have John Kerry with him. So he was able to talk frankly with his counterpart, Russian President Putin. So he said, what's this deal? And Putin said, look, we've talked to the Syrians. They're willing to destroy all the chemical weapons that they have. They're very old, they're decrepit, but they're willing to destroy it under UN supervision on a U.S. ship outfitted for the precise reason of destroying chemical weapons. So, Obama, how do you know that? Putin, we've been working with the Syrians. Watch the Syrian foreign minister tomorrow on TV. Syrian foreign minister says we're ready to give up all our chemical weapons under UN supervision and have them destroyed. Obama says, wow, that means I don't have to start another war. Putin said, yeah, right. Obama goes back and he faces into the neocons and he says, this is a solution. I don't have to strike out against Syria, and I'm not going to. Later, 2 years later, Obama brags to his biographer, I didn't go by the Washington playbook. I defied them and didn't start a war. Now, what's the point of all this? Well, they worked something out one-on-one, and it prevented a war. That's big, okay? So Putin writes an op-ed. It appears in the New York Times on the 12th of September. Right in the midst of all this, but after they had agreed that this would be the solution. What does he say? He says, I applaud the growing trust that exists between our two countries and also between myself and President Obama. But there's one thing I have to disagree with him on, and that is that some countries, like the U.S., are exceptional. President Obama just said this last week, says Putin in this op-ed, and I disagree. I think all countries are equal. I think some are closer to democracy, some others are farther away, some are big, some are small. But when God looks on countries, he considers them all equal, period, end quote. Wow. Now, remember, that's September 12th, 2013. I described that as the apogee, the high point of Russian-U.S. relations for the last couple of decades. What happened? Well, there are people that don't want decreased tension with Russia. The people who build the arms, sell the arms, get rich by selling the arms, and the people who, for whatever reason, consider Putin and the Russian people in a kind of racist way, just next to the devil in evilness, okay? What did they do? Well, it took them 6 months, but they orchestrated a coup in Kiev, Ukraine, on the 22nd of February, 2014. No one can doubt that they orchestrated this coup. It was the most blatant coup in history. Why? Because it was advertised on YouTube 2.5 weeks before it broke out. When YouTube played on the 4th of February 2014 an intercepted conversation where Victoria Nuland, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, was talking to her ambassador in Kiev, the U.S. ambassador there, plotting the coup, naming the names of the people who would take the prime ministership and other posts. Yats is the guy, she said. Yatsenyuk, what happened to him? Well, after the coup, he became prime minister, okay? And then the coup de grace here at the end, um, um, Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador the U.S. had in Kiev at the time, says to his superior, Victoria Nuland, and this is all in The Intercept, verified as legitimate, authentic. What are we going to do about the EU, the European Union? They're not going to like this. And Nuland says, the F word, like it's got 4 letters, F the EU. Now, she says one other thing. To get this coup glued together and the new government we're installing widely recognized, we need an international personage. So I, Victoria Nuland, have just talked to Jake Sullivan. Jake Sullivan is National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. And he tells me, says Victoria Nuland, that Biden's willing to come and sew this thing up and give his imprimatur to it. So he's ready. If we need him, then we have an international personality, the vice president. His name is Biden. So that's how far it went. That's all in the video, all in the intercepted conversation that was put on YouTube on the 4th of February 2014. The coup came on the 22nd. So I kind of thought, well, I know a little bit about coups, and this one's been blown, right? I mean, ain't going to be no coup now. They know who the people are going to be. Well, that wasn't the case. They're so blatant that they went ahead with it anyway. Was I alone in thinking that? No. Vladimir Putin apparently thought the same thing because he stayed in Sochi at the Winter Olympics until he had to come back the day after the coup. Now, what did he do on the day after the coup? Well, obviously, he convened his top national security advisors, and he said, well, what are we going to do about our only ice-free, year-long naval base in Sevastopol? And they said, well, that's in Crimea. If they're going to join NATO, we're not going to let them take Crimea. And so there was a plebiscite. The Crimeans overwhelmingly voted to rejoin Russia. And that's why Crimea became annexed to Russia. Main point here, there is not a scintilla. There's no evidence at all that it ever entered Putin's mind to annex Crimea before the coup on the 22nd of February 2014. Now, that's just the beginning. It goes downhill from there, but those were the key things. And what American people, by and large, don't know, because the media doesn't tell them, is that there was this coup. It was right on the doorstep of Russia, and they threatened to join NATO. And besides that, they had emplacements for the kinds of capsules that can handle not only anti-ballistic missiles, but also things like Tomahawk cruise missiles and hypersonic missiles. So there's not only a rhetorical or strategic threat, there's a tactical threat where Putin has made it clear, has made it very obvious that he doesn't want these kinds of missiles on his doorstep, which would give him, well, he said it himself at the end of December, it would give him 7 to 10 minutes warning time if it were a slow-moving Tomahawk missiles before it reached Moscow. And if it were a hypersonic missile, it would give him 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes to decide whether to blow up the rest of the world. I mean, that's what it comes to, really, okay? He didn't want that. And so he tried to negotiate and said, look, we don't want these things right on our periphery. It's very, very similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had its denouement, which had its peak 60 years ago, exactly today, on the 28th of October, 1962. What do I mean? I mean that Khrushchev backed down. He said, well, we tried to put missiles in Cuba. Kennedy is threatening nuclear war. Let's get out of here. What do? Well, we get Kennedy to promise not to invade Cuba. And then we say, okay, well, we won. The U.S. is not going to invade Cuba. We can pull the missiles out. He backed down. Now, why did he back down? Because he saw that Kennedy saw an existential threat. An existential threat if medium-range ballistic missiles were placed in Cuba. They were already there. Were the nuclear warheads there? Yes, we know now. We didn't know then. How far could they reach? Not only Washington, D.C., but Omaha, Nebraska, where our Strategic Air Command was. This was an existential threat. Now, Khrushchev, when he conferred with his, we know a lot about this now because we have the Soviet documents that have been released. He said, well, it's not an existential threat for us. It was a good try, right? It was a gambit. It didn't work. Are we going to risk nuclear war for this? No, let's just pull the missiles out and say we extracted a promise the United States would not invade Cuba. Now, why do I mention that now? Not only because it's the 60th anniversary exactly, but because Putin, like President Kennedy, sees an existential threat from these missile emplacements already in Romania, going into Poland, almost finished there, and didn't want them in Ukraine as well. Now, did he get satisfaction from the U.S. that this wouldn't happen? No, and that's a long story. The U.S. people don't know this very much because they don't follow what people say as closely as I do. But if you're interested, I can show you how Putin in December raised issues specifically with Joseph Biden, our president, and Biden promised. Get this, folks. Biden promised on the 30th of December in a telephone call or Zoom or whatever it was with Putin. And the readout from that telephone call was, quote, Mr. Biden said that the U.S. had no intention of deploying offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. The Russians were delighted with this. They said our negotiations, which were about to begin in Geneva, are off to a very good start. This is a big, big, good step. Guess what? Somebody got to the president and said, Joe, my God, did you really say that to Putin? He said, well, yeah. Well, forget about it, Joe. We're not going to do that. And so the negotiators were not allowed to even mention the president's promise not to deploy offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Now, Putin is watching all this, and the next time he talks to Biden, the readout is Biden did not mention anything about not deploying offensive strike missiles in Ukraine as he had 6 weeks prior on December the 30th. What is Putin to think? Well, number one, who's running the show in Washington? And number two, can I trust these people? Well, he decided he couldn't. And with the support of China, which is a very major factor here, he decided that he had to invade Ukraine. Now, people say to me, Ray, you're not condoning, you're not saying that it's okay to invade another country. No, that's not what an intelligence analyst does. An intelligence analyst tries to figure out why. Why did Putin do this? Okay. And as I watch the assurances that Putin sought, the promise that he didn't get, and the threat not only of continuing destruction of these Russian speakers outside of Russia, namely in Ukraine, but also the prospect of this NATO-trained army, NATO-trained in the past 7 years, attacking Donbass, Donetsk, and Lugansk, which it appears they were about to do I think that I can understand, okay? I can understand why Putin decided the only solution here is for me to clean these guys out and take back Donetsk and Lugansk and see what else happens. Do I have allies in this? I do. Xi Jinping, he couldn't pick a better ally, and so he went ahead. So people say to me, McGovern, shall you think that's all right? Look, what I say to them is this. I think Putin, like any president, considers his main duty and first and foremost duty to defend his country from outside aggression. I have to say we give him that. That is a major objective of his reckoning. So here's McGovern. Why don't we try to be a little empathetic here and put ourselves in Putin's shoes, okay? And I watch all this activity going back to the coup in Kiev, 2014, and I see the encroachment of NATO closer and closer to the east, despite promises in the past not to do that. So what's the bottom line for me? I say to my friends, no. I don't want to be a hypocrite. Hypocrites are not nice people. So if I was sure, well, let me put it this way. If I were Putin, I'm not sure what I would have done. When you're president of a country and you see an existential threat, and you have the power and the potential to react to that threat, that's what you do. That's what John Kennedy did on Cuba. Was the blockade legal? No. Was his assembly of an invasion force prepared to go into Cuba legal? Not so much. Was his threatening of nuclear war legal? Well, UN says you're not supposed to do that. But nobody said, Mr. Kennedy, what you're trying to do is unprovoked. It was provoked. And that's the way I look at Vladimir Putin. I think that when we have to be honest here and say that we provoked him into these measures. And you can talk about the morality, you can talk about how terrible it is that people are suffering. I feel really bad about that. I honestly do. But the corollary here is that if you want to stop this, if you want to have a ceasefire, and you have an imbalance of power in that area of the world where the Russians have most of the power, then you got to figure out why they did it. Okay, why Putin? What motivated Putin to do this? And once you figure that out, then you can meet and negotiate, for God's sake. That's the way we used to do it, and that's precisely the way we did it on Cuba. And there are no high-level contacts worth mentioning now that things have gotten so bad between Russia and the United States.
And why did the U.S. choose to confront Russia instead of negotiating? Was it because of they wanted to trap and weaken Russia and then go after the containment of China? Was it the plan?
I think plan is something that is a too nice term for what our policymakers have in mind. In my view, people like Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan are exceptional people. That is, people who have been given to believe they are exceptional. They've attended the finest schools. They've been given the most wonderful privileges. They are precisely the same kinds of people that advised John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson to go into Vietnam because we were exceptional. The French couldn't beat these ragged, barefoot jungle people, but we are exceptional. We could. There was a book written about it. It's called The Best and the Brightest. So you'll have the direct descendants of those people. They come from the same Ivy League schools. They have no real experience. They never wore a uniform. They don't know what war is like. This is very dangerous, okay? Joe Biden, does he know what war is like? 5 deferments during Vietnam. How many did Cheney have? 5 deferments during Vietnam. Well, okay, nothing against deferments, but the fact is Joe Biden doesn't know what war is like either. Luckily, every Russian that was in on those discussions with Khrushchev 60 years ago on Cuba had been in World War II. That's big. The Russians, as your listeners may know, lost 26 million people plus in that war. Imagine that, 26 million people. Everyone, even today, has a relative, grandfather or so, that had the experience of real war at the hands of the Nazis, okay? So, deciding on Cuba, when Khrushchev said, look, we know what war is like. This guy Kennedy seems serious. It's not an existential threat for us. It's a political embarrassment to withdraw, but let's keep our heads screwed on right and get those missiles back home. And that was the decision. He didn't face any big backlash for that. They were sensible people. Now, there is a sense that's drummed into you if you're exposed to war. And unfortunately, the people that are now calling the shots in Washington have no concept of this. John Kennedy did. So did those around him. They had served. They knew what war was like. Not the same way that the Russians did, but they knew. Kennedy, of course, himself was within that PT boat. So this is a big difference, and it gives me great concern that these people who think we're exceptional and that the Russians are, well, you know, when I speak at universities, very often people ask about, well, do you think the United States of America is indispensable, like Madeleine Albright and other people, high statesmen have said? So I always say, well, what's, you know what a synonym is? And most of them say, yeah, that's a like word. They said, okay, well, how about an antonym? And one or two of them said, oh, yeah, that's an opposite word. So I asked them, okay, so what's the antonym for indispensable? And they stroke their chin, and usually one of them says, whoa, dispensable? I say, that's right. So, if the United States is indispensable, by definition, all the other countries, Brazil, all the other countries, especially Russia, are dispensable. Now, there was a time where the United States could get away with that. That time has ended. The only problem is that these exceptional people don't realize that no longer are we indispensable. We're not even exceptional, except for the fact, and mark my words, this is very important, except for the fact that the world has now been divided into, people talk about multipolar world. Well, in a sense, they're quite right. But I look at it as a world not unipolar as it was ever since World War II with the U.S., the main pole, so to speak. It's bipolar in both senses of the word, all right? In psychiatric sense as well. But in the geostrategic sense, it's bipolar because on the one hand, you have the lily white West, NATO. Look at them. They're all lily white. The closest you get to people of color is Turkey, okay? The lily white West against the rest of the world, primarily people of color. China, India, Iran, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa. So would our policymakers in their indispensable way say Russia is isolated? Well, I hope they don't really believe that, but I have to allow for the likelihood that they do. Why? Because we're exceptional, we're indispensable. Russia is sort of like the Untermensch, pardon the expression. And of course, a lot of the Russians are people of color as well. So just to sum this up, it's a very dangerous situation we're in right now, because what China and Russia call the collective West, which is lily white, is arrayed against the rest of the world, including not only China, India, Russia, and many other countries who are fed up with this unipolar thing. You can call it multipolar if you want. I call it bipolar.
US thinks that it is exceptional, that's why it has Monroe Doctrine for itself, but it doesn't apply to anybody else in this world.
Well, obviously, Putin is not entitled to have a Monroe Doctrine. Otherwise, there would be no struggle over Ukraine. Yeah, it's the Monroe Doctrine is one of the symptoms here. If you go back to the end of World War II, Russia was pretty much destroyed. Most of Western Europe was. I visited Western Europe when I was in college in 1959. So what's that? 14 years after the end of the war. Munich was in rubble. Traces of the war were all over the place, even in some places that had not been heavily bombed. So this is the reality. No, we emerged from that with casualties of about 400,000 soldiers, as opposed to the Russians, 26 million people, half of them soldiers. And we sort of inherited the riches of the world. Now, George Kennan, who knew a lot about the Soviet Union and the Russians, he was an exceptional person. He was an elitist, in some senses a bit of a racist, but he used to be the person that I admired most because he knew most about Russia. What he said in the first policy planning statement from the State Department after the war, I think the year was 1948, he said, look, here's the reality. We have domain, we, the United States, we have domain over 50% of the world's natural resources. Our policies have to be devised in such a way as to keep that disproportion. We can't be diverted by things like human rights and soft things like that don't really matter. It will come to our having to exercise hard power if we want to keep our domain over this 50%. Because when push comes to shove, please realize that although we own 50% of the world's wealth, we're only 6.3% of the world's population. Okay, folks, guess what? Now America is only 4.3% of the world's population, and we can't even pretend to be able to exercise this kind of influence any longer. The game is over. Now, I'll add a little footnote to this because Kennan was a very smart guy. When it became clear that President Clinton was going to go back on
George Kennan,
his predecessor's promise. Now, when I'm talking about President Clinton now. Yeah, George Kennan is what we were talking about before. When it became clear to George Kennan that Bill Clinton was going to renege on George H.W. Bush's promise not to move NATO 1 inch to the east of East Germany, when it became clear that Clinton was going to violate that promise and move NATO eventually right up to Russia's border, Kennan spoke out and he said, "This is the worst policy mistake you could make in the post-war years. We have to realize where we are here. This would be a terrific mistake because it would encourage a Russian response that we would have to take into account." And indeed, that's exactly what we have now. When that promise was made, as many of your viewers will probably remember, that was February 1, 1990, about a month and a half after the Berlin Wall fell. And James Baker, a Texas lawyer who was Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush, went to Moscow. And to his credit, George H.W. Bush wanted, as I said before, a Europe that was whole and free from Portugal to Vladivostok in the east, right? Well, Baker was a smart Texas lawyer. And he said, now, Mikhail Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, here's the deal. We want a reunited Germany. Now, when Ray McGovern, heard that, I got the shakes. Why? Well, I was alive during World War II. I was very little. Then I watched all kinds of movies about the Germans, okay? And I lived in Germany for 5 years on active duty. I was afraid of the Germans, but I'm an American. We only lost about 400,000 soldiers in World War II. I'm not a Russian. I'm not Gorbachev from a country that lost 26 million during World War II at the hands of the Germans. So, needless to say, this was a very bitter pill to ask Gorbachev, and Shevardnadze was his foreign minister, to swallow a reunited Germany. So they said, well, we have to think about this. Came back the next day and said, what's the quo here? That's a really bitter quid. My God. Reunited Germany. Quid. What's the quo? And then Baker, this Texas lawyer, says, whoa, how would it be if we promised not to move NATO 1 inch to the east of the German border? How would that be? And Gorbachev and Shevardnadze said, well, now bear in mind, they expected a lot of help from the U.S., economic help as well as other help. So they were inclined to say, well, you promise? And James Baker said, cross my heart and I hope to die, as they say in Texas, okay? They bought the promise. They didn't even get it written down. Was it real? Of course it was real. It's in all of the notes of not only the State Department, but the German Foreign Ministry. The German chancellor was there the next day, made exactly the same promise. So here in 1995, 1996, our President Clinton decides to renege on that promise. And Kennan says, this is the worst thing you could possibly do. We're going to get a really aggressive Russian reaction. And of course, that's what we have 20 years later. Was it predictable? Of course it was. Was Putin's invasion of Ukraine unprovoked? Well, you're not going to leave that to your viewers to decide, given some of the history that I've adduced a little while ago.
Yeah. And why do you think in Europe you can't see the sovereignty? It's so much in hand of the U.S., Europe today. All the leaders, I don't know. I'm not talking about the people. I'm talking about the leaders in Europe. They are all in hand of U.S. If the U.S. want to do something, they go after what the US want. Why it's like this?
Nima, you asked the $64 question. I have to give you a frank answer. I can't understand it. It's fact. They still are under the thumb of the United States, but you draw an important distinction between the people and the rulers that they elect. Now, I can't understand why the Germans would suffer the loss of their industries and let their people suffer from the cold this winter rather than accept what little Russian gas they need to get through the winter, and where they would not suspect that people who have talked about getting rid of Nord Stream 1 and 2, that they weren't responsible? Well, come on, Who benefits from the destruction, from the sabotage destroying these pipelines? Well, I'll leave that to your viewers. So, in other words, here are the Germans. They had a chance. There was one line still is a little bit open. Will the Germans freeze to death? Will they let their industries falter? Just because the U.S. says, no, you can't do that? Well, that defies explanation, and that's why I have none. I have no explanation. It's the same for the French. You would think that the U.S. hand, after 77 years from the war, would have gotten a little weaker, where these people would stand up and think for themselves. Well, I'm not afraid. I fully expect that the people in these countries, France, Germany, in Czechoslovakia, there have already been 70,000 people demonstrating in Wenceslas Square against these policies. So I think that this is going to be a short-lived sort of thing. That as soon as the European populace realize that they're being had, that these people who are ruling them have something really queer about them, where they can't stand up to Uncle Sam, and where they will even condone the destruction of the pipelines that would have been their salvation and not even complain, or worse still, blame it on guess who? The Russians. So we're asked to believe that the Russians destroyed their own pipelines? I mean, hello, they could have just turned the spigot off, right? Oh, God. So they frittered away this main advantage. Some of people asking are suggesting that the Russians blew their own bridge up, the Kerch Bridge over the Kerch Straits to Crimea. People say, this had to be the Russians. Well, the propaganda offensive has been so thick in this country, the United States, that Americans are inclined to believe anything about the Russians, even that they would shoot themselves in this foot with the explosions of the Nord Stream, and in this foot with blowing up their only bridge to Crimea. And that is the function of 6 straight years of Russia, 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 so-called Russiagate, which started with charges that Russia had hacked the Democratic National Committee and interfered with our election in 2016. What American people don't know is that there is documentary evidence now from congressional testimony, from court statements, from emails relating to court proceedings, that this was all invented by Hillary Clinton and President Obama. There was no Russian hack. And the person charged with investigating the Russian hack has said so under oath in testimony. He said it on the 5th of December, 2017. Do the math. Do Americans know this? No. It's been suppressed since December 5, 2017 until today, 28th of October, 2022. So the media is really the problem here. First of all, Congress suppressed it, but then the media has suppressed it even longer. 2.5 years, the media has suppressed this information. What's the information? There is no technical evidence that the Russians or anyone else hacked those damaging emails from the Democratic National Committee. Why damaging? Well, they showed that Hillary Clinton pretty much stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders as the campaign proceeded, and nobody wanted that to be believed. So they said, well, no, this is Russian propaganda. It wasn't. It was given to WikiLeaks some other way. In other words, bottom line, there was no Russian hack. More important, bottom line, nobody knows that. The Russians know it. And of course, Obama threw out 35 Russian diplomats because of this non-existent hack. So again, put yourself in Putin's shoes. What's going on here? Are they willing to accuse Russia of interfering in elections just as a partisan sort of political ploy? Well, yeah, because that's what they did. Are these people trustworthy? Well, we have to put our guard up, and we have to make sure that when we doverai, when we trust, we proverai, we just verify, okay? So it's really a tough situation now, the more so since the top leaders of both countries are not communicating, and that was a necessary element to prevent the Cuban Missile Crisis exactly 60 years ago, 60 years ago, from flying out of hand. And the reason that you and I, Nima, can be having this discussion today is because Khrushchev backed off. Why? Because there was no existential threat to Russia. Was it an existential threat to the U.S.? Yeah, they certainly thought so. We all thought so. What's the difference? Putin feels an existential threat from NATO infringement and from these medium-range ballistic missile-capable sites, okay? Is he going to back off? You don't back off from existential threats if you have the power, including nuclear weaponry, to resist. So, bottom line here, Putin's not going to back off, okay? Does he have the wherewithal to proceed even further into Ukraine? He does. Watch what happens in the next couple of months. Is Ukraine an existential threat to the United States? No way. No way, okay? So who needs to back off? I'll leave that to your viewers to decide, but it seemed pretty clear to me that I hope, well, one can only hope, that Biden or whoever's running things in Washington has children and grandchildren like we do and cares a lot about what happens to them. Otherwise, we're in really, really dire straits.
I see. And we see that in mainstream media in the U.S. and which is coming from the U.S. officials, they are trying for years and years to demonizing Putin, Putinizing Russia, and you eventually end up with demonizing Russian people. We are seeing this. All Russians are sanctioned in each and every way possible.
Well, we're talking about the reaction among the American people. Let me broaden this out just a little bit. General Eisenhower, who was our president in the early 50s, he warned as he left office, and he had been a general, as you know, he warned about something he called the military-industrial complex. And he explained that since World War II, the arms makers, the arms dealers, the arms sellers, the arms people that support congressional candidates who in turn appropriate more money for arms making, arms dealing, arms selling. It's quite a nice little circle here, that they are to be feared, that the accretion of power among the military-industrial complex was inevitable unless, and this is the key, unless there were a well-informed citizenry. We don't have a well-informed citizenry. And we don't have just a MIC and MIC anymore. We have what I've coined a new acronym. If you have a piece of paper and a pencil or at a keyboard, get this down. It's on the final exam, okay? I call it the Mickey Mat. It's easy to remember because it bears a resemblance to Mickey Mouse, okay? Mickey Mat. The military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Mickey Mat. Now, why do I say media as if in all capital letters? Because media is the linchpin. It doesn't work without the media. And who controls the media? The same corporations that profiteer from war. Who owns the media? Those same corporations. And so, whereas Eisenhower called for a well-informed citizenry, the media, controlled by these same forces that want to make arms and sell them and get richer and richer and richer at the expense of poor people, keeping them down, well, they're ruling the roost right now, together with people who think that Russians are a little less than equal. And you have ridiculous things like Obama's head director of national intelligence. His name was James Clapper. Now, he was an old Air Force general. He knew about the Russians. After he left office, he was interviewed and he says, you know, I know the history of the Russians. They're almost genetically driven to be deceitful, to co-opt, to do evil things. This is a known characteristic, almost genetic, in the Russian people. This is the guy in charge of all the intelligence agencies in the U.S. government. Did he really believe that? He's not the sharpest knife in the drawer, as we usually say. But it's hard to believe that he really believes the Russians are genetically driven to do these things. So this is what, here I am, trying to put my feet in Putin's shoes, right? And I say, my God, who's running this show? Who's telling Blinken and Sullivan and the others what to do? Why is this guy General Petraeus, who lost in Iraq, who lost in Afghanistan, who knows nothing about Vietnam because just a little boy, who's listening? Why do they listen to him still? Well, because there's a lot of money in the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Mickey Mat. Now, I'll say one more thing on this. I'm a Catholic, and I like Pope Francis. I don't share everything he believes, but sometimes he hits the nail right on the head. So here he is in 2015, I think it was. He appears before a joint committee of the U.S. Congress, the joint Congress, both of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And he gets up and he makes a pretty good speech, in the midst of which he says, quote, the main problem is the blood-drenched arms traders, period, end quote. Well, yay! The Congress people in the Senate, oh, yeah. And then they look in their pockets to see if the latest envelope from Lockheed or from Raytheon or from Boeing didn't slip out of their pockets while they were clapping. It was giving hypocrisy a bad name, for God's sake. All these people who profiteer on the profiteering on war were applauding the Pope for naming the problem, which is the blood-drenched arms traders. He had it right. Now, how can we do this? Well, it takes an informed citizenry, as Eisenhower warned. And so we're trying to chip away and say to the American people, look, you've been sold down the road so many times. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There were all kinds of lies told about not only Afghanistan, not only Iraq, but also Libya. And when are you going to grow up? When are you going to give a good example to the Europeans and say, look, we're up to here with this stuff. We want the truth. And we retired people who used to be able to tell the truth when we were in active service. We stand ready to help, and we keep producing things so that people can have a place to go to learn the truth.
And back into Nord Stream sabotage, and we see that the Swedish government investigated the case, and they found something. They found some evidence, but they are not willing to share it with Germany or other countries in the EU. Why they're not putting their evidence out if they're believing that Russia did this?
Well, let me just say that it's very clear that the U.S. had a very, very big hand in this. When you look at a crime like this, you look about motive, you look about means. Did they have the means to do this? You talk about the result that they hope to expect. Well, the president himself said that the Nord Stream pipeline would not go through if Russia invaded Ukraine. They had the means. They had military. The Baltic Sea is a NATO lake, for Pete's sake. The Danes and the Swedes know everything that went on in that area. And then after it was blown, this, I have to be careful here. I know some words I want to use for Antony Blinken, our Secretary of State. He bragged, this is a tremendous opportunity for our selling natural gas instead of the Russians. Hello? What a stupid thing to say, even if true. So what are the Swedes doing? The Swedes are a vassal state. They are no longer neutral. I think back to the days of Olof Palme, where they could stand on their own 2 feet, be a neutral nation, and help peace in the world. They've succumbed. Their security forces and so forth, their military have succumbed to the blandishments of the UK and the US. Now, how do I know that? Well, how much time do we have? I can just adduce one example, okay? When Julian Assange exposed the war crimes of the US military in Afghanistan and Iraq, the US needed to get him. How did they get him? They got him through the Swedes. How did the Swedes get him? Well, for those of you who don't know, he had an affair with 2 women in Sweden, okay? And it was consensual. It was, they had intercourse. It was no big problem until one of the women said, oh my God, I wonder if he has AIDS. Let's get Julian to be tested for AIDS. And Julian said, I just got tested recently. I'm okay. I'm not going to do that. And so they thought, oh my God, well, we're going to worry about this forever. Let's go to the police just to see, just not to make a complaint or anything, but just to see, can we force Julian Assange to take a test for AIDS? They went to the police and they said, look, this was all consensual. All we want to know is, do we have the right to get Julian to get it tested for AIDS? And the Swedish police, with their liaison partners, you can imagine who they would be from abroad, made this into a rape case, published and demeaned Julian Assange before the world, thinking, people still think in this country that he's some sort of rapist. Now, how do I know all this? I know this because Niels Melzer, the UN rapporteur for torture, took an interest in Julian Assange's case, and guess what? He went to Sweden to see how it all happened, how they got their clutches on Julian. Now, whether the Swedes knew that Niels Melzer was fluent in Swedish, whether they knew that or not, I don't know, but they let him look at the police records. They took copious notes, and he reported back, look, they had nothing on Julian Assange. This was just a ruse to capture him. And as you all know, where that led, Julian wanted to stay in Sweden to face whatever charges the women wanted to put up, because the women were honest people. They weren't going to make charges, but they wouldn't do it. They delayed, and they let the lawyers do this and the friendly intelligence services. Well, that was back, 12 years or so ago. And Julian has been in some sort of captivity with his liberty infringed ever since, in the last couple of years, in the maximum security prison in Glenmarshire in London, with no charges other than, they just want to keep him, there. He's got COVID. And whether he survives this one or not, I don't know. My own guess is that the U.S. authorities would love to have Julian die of COVID. It'd be a big problem off their hands, and they will have demonstrated what they set out to demonstrate. That is, no matter who you are, whether you're Australian, Swedish, or Brazilian, or from Antarctica, or from Norway, we're going to get you, because we are the United States. We're exceptional. We're indispensable. We have tentacles all over the place. Not only the Swedes will do our business, but others will too. So don't even think of publishing about things like U.S. war crimes, because we're going to get you. And we're going to do to you exactly what we've been doing to Julian for 12 years now. He's going to have a no good end, almost certainly. That's going to happen to you if you speak out. Freedom of the press? Forget about it. Magna Carta? I mean, over 800 years ago. Those gutsy nobles, they were English nobles. They're not the common people. Noble. They wrested these rights from King John, okay? Habeas corpus, freedom of the press. And what happened? Well, they forgot about it. No, they forgot about it because there's a unipolar world, and we can do what we want. And that's happening within the United States as well, with gross infringement of our Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment against illegal searches and seizures. And so things are getting things are going downhill quickly. I dare say there's still hope, but we have to get off our derrieres and make sure that our fellow Americans know how serious the situation is. And we have to stick our necks out to make that point clear to everyone.
How do you see the future of Turkey in NATO? Because Turkey gonna have much stronger economic ties with Russia. They're gonna have a gas hub in Turkey. How do you see these relations between Russia and Turkey? How this plays out for NATO?
Well, for NATO, it's not a good thing. I mean, you have Russia and Turkey on the eastern anchor of NATO becoming very friendly indeed. And as you just mentioned, Turkey being the potential beneficiary of lots of gas and oil pipelines going through Turkey. This is an amazing windfall for Turkey. What will the Germans say about having to pay twice or three times as much money after commissions and everything else? The Turks would be pleased. But so, in a word, Turkey has always been a kind of questionable member of NATO. When Turkey invaded Cyprus, 1974, I believe it was. Now, the Greeks were up in arms. The Greeks and the Turks have always been at each other's throats. So what I see is Greece gravitating more toward NATO, Turkey playing a very adroit role in cultivating relations with everyone, including China, Iran, and others. And probably, I'm guessing here, seeing the handwriting on the wall that NATO and U.S. domination of NATO is not going to last very much longer. Give it a year or two, but that year or two will give us Turks the flexibility and the opportunity to cultivate ties where it really counts in the future, and that is with Russia and with China.
Yeah. How we can put an end to this insanity, to this war in Ukraine? How do you see this?
The insanity. It's worse than insanity. It's racist. It's money grubbing. And it's this feeling of exceptionalism. The only solution I would go back to is Eisenhower's dictum that to prevent this kind of insanity, you need a well-educated public. Now, there has to be a way to get around the mainstream media and its censors. We have the internet now. That's being infringed upon also, but we have all kinds of technical ways to get information out. How do we persuade Americans who are working 2 jobs and trying to feed their kids, put them into bed, and then watch Fox News to be entertained? How do we get those Americans to focus on the real subject here? That is the increasing danger of a wider war in Europe and, God forbid, elsewhere. So the challenge here is that Americans do not know what war is like. Except for those people in Hawaii, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. has really been able to be protected by 2 very large oceans, okay? That's not the case anymore. Whether U.S. strategic planners know this or not, and they surely do, Russia and China have the wherewithal to destroy us all in minutes. I'm talking about sophisticated weaponry that the Russians in particular developed when they saw us developing things like anti-ballistic missile systems that will never work. There are all kinds of ways to get around that. And the Russians have about 5 new missile systems designed and well tested to do precisely that. So what we need to do is just kind of make sure that we American citizens go to our political leaders and say, look, this is the situation as we understand it. How do you understand it? And if they give you a bunch of malarkey, a bunch of bull in return, then you're well educated. You can change their views. Now, that's going to take a long time. I just hope that in the interim, people are smart enough to keep their hands off the keys to the nuclear weapons and will kind of step back as Khrushchev did exactly 60 years ago, okay? It's possible to be sane. It's possible to try, as the U.S. has, to make the situation untenable for Russia in Eastern Europe. We've tried. It didn't work. When it came to Ukraine, the Russians said, no, you don't do this. So are we as wise? Are we as empathetic as Khrushchev was? He saw Kennedy's problem. He said, in effect, okay, it was a gambit. I thought it would work. Didn't work. Are we going to risk nuclear war just because our gambit didn't work? No, I don't think so. And he had unanimous support to do the right thing, embarrassing though it was. And there were sweeteners thrown in there. We know that the original deal, the one that was solidified exactly 60 years ago today, when Khrushchev wrote to Kennedy and said, okay, we'll withdraw the missiles, we'll dismantle them, we'll put them in crates, and we'll get them out of there if you promise not to invade Cuba. That was the deal, okay? Now, there was another deal. Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, had talked to the Russian ambassador Dobrynin and said, look, we're willing to consider what you proposed before, those missiles in Turkey, U.S. missiles in Turkey. But, you know, we're not going to make that part of this deal. We'll have a tacit understanding. We'll have a promise, an oral promise, which we won't write down. But my brother, John Kennedy, the president, says that if you go through with this deal, we will, within 4 or 5 months, withdraw those missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev comes back in a private message this time and says, okay, we understand that you would have all kinds of problems with NATO if you admitted that you were going to withdraw those missiles from Turkey. I, Khrushchev, understand that, and so we won't make a big deal of this, and we will keep it secret as you require, but we fully expect this to be done in 4 or 5 months. Guess what? They did keep it quiet. It was done in 4 or 5 months, and that was part of the broader deal. But the deal itself was just twofold: extraction of the missiles and a pledge not to invade Cuba. What's my point here? My point here is that when people talk, you can see what really bothers them, right? And if there's not an overt public way to satisfy what bothers them, you can always work around the edges. You can always send your brother to talk to the Russian ambassador, right? And say, look, we understand your concern about those missiles in Turkey. Please understand our concern that we can't say, oh, we gave up our missiles in Turkey to get the missiles out of Cuba. No, we can't do that. That's not politically possible for us. Do you understand? Khrushchev says, yeah, I understand. But I'm going to remember that promise. Now, did the U.S. deliver on the promise? I think, as I may have already said, yes, they did. When? In 4 or 5 months, okay? So these things, you can work them out if you talk. Right now, there are no talks going on. 30 Democrats, 3 days ago now, proposed to the president, you ought to talk to Putin. Guess what? Several hours later, they said, oh, no, we didn't mean that. No. Hello? Now, there is a summit going to happen in Bali, in Indonesia. I think, well, Xi Jinping is going. Putin hasn't decided yet. I think that's wise. A lot of people would like to shoot Putin down. Security in such circumstances is really quite a challenge. I think he'll end up going. So you have Xi Jinping and you'll have Putin. Will Biden go? I suspect it'll be too embarrassing for him not to go. Now, when you talk about embarrassing, last time, the preparatory meeting for this summit in Indonesia, Antony Blinken said, I'm not going to talk to Lavrov. I'm just going to talk to the Chinese guy. Okay. So he made a big thing of leaving the room anytime Lavrov came by, the Russian foreign minister, and he wanted to have a big ostentatious meeting with the Chinese guy, as if that's going to draw a wedge between China and Russia. I don't think so. So picture Biden. Biden's in Bali, Indonesia, and he sees Putin come in. And he goes, no. Is he going to leave the room? And is he going to say, oh, Xi Jinping, I'll talk to you? I mean, hello, it's so ridiculous. It's third grade elementary school stuff. And the people that are advising Biden, I'm sure they passed the third grade. I'm sure that they went to the finest schools, but they don't know anything about war and they don't know much about life. I just hope for the best and make sure that we can educate people to the best of our degree to be able to do that.
Yeah. A poll came out yesterday, shows over half Americans oppose Ukraine aid. 71% of Republicans, 44% of Democrats, and 62% of independents. Why these people cannot get their voice heard by U.S. officials?
Well, the system is constructed in such a way that what citizens believe can be just discarded. Witness Iraq. Most Americans were against the war in Iraq, even though most Americans had been deceived about weapons of mass destruction. And he went ahead anyway. Bush did in those days. So these people don't really feel accountable to the American people. Bush started, the younger Bush, George W. Bush, started what Nuremberg, after World War II, what Nuremberg called a war of aggression. Now, they defined that. They said that to perpetrate a war of aggression, well, that's the supreme, this is a quote, that's the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes only in as much as it contains the accumulated evil of the whole. Accumulated evil of the whole. Torture, kidnapping. So, George W. Bush perpetrated that war with the help of Dick Cheney and people like Colin Powell, who lied to the UN to justify it. Have they been held to account? No. I live in a southern city here. Raleigh is the name. It's North Carolina. George W. Bush was invited here to address the Boy Scouts of America and give them inspiration to be patriotic. Now, the reason I mention that is because we developed what we called a welcome committee. We did two things. We put billboards up on the main thoroughfares saying, coming to Raleigh, war criminal, September 16th, mentioning the arena where he would be. Put that up a week before the 16th of September when he was due to arrive. And then we organized the welcome committee with placards which would be set at the only entrance to this arena and which would say what he is, a war criminal, and that he should be arrested. And that's what we did. The local police let us do that. Why am I saying all this? Because George W. Bush, former president of the United States, had to slither in, had to sneak into that arena. I don't know how he got in there. He did give a little talk, and then he had to slither out like some common criminal, which he is. So that's, in the broad scheme of things, a small thing. But he knows that he can't get the kind of reception elsewhere in the United States where those Texans applaud the fact that he misspoke and said, yeah, I did a ruthless attack on another country. They laughed, okay? So what we need to do is, in small ways or big ways, face down these people and say, we know what you did. We find it not only illegal, but reprehensible. You should be a war criminal. But until we can get you into The Hague, we're going to make it really uncomfortable. We're going to let the Secret Service know that this is not a hospital place, Raleigh, North Carolina. So if you want to come here and talk to Boy Scouts, you better sneak in and you better sneak out, and don't let any publicity attend this. None of the newspapers, none of the media covered the thing. Well, that's a small sort of victory. If we pile on to things like that, then I think that we have enough energy and we have enough imagination to do these things. Sometimes I close with a favorite expression I have. It comes from the Bible, sort of. It has to do with Noah, okay? Noah and his ark. So what I call it the Noah principle. Ready? No more awards for predicting rain. Awards only for building arks. Okay? We can grouse and we can complain about the state of the media and the fact that, so far our efforts have not been very successful. What we really need to do is not predict more rain, but build an ark. Bring some wood. Give some ideas. Do something courageous, like speak up in a venue where criminals like George W. Bush would be. That's what we need to do. Not complain or predict more rain, but build arks. Bring your own plank. We'll stick it together. And, little by little, there's a chance we will prevail. One of my heroes, Cesar Chavez, he used to also say, when I volunteered or I recommended an action, a real action, people would say, oh, there aren't enough of us. And I would say, there are enough of us. But if there's no action, nothing's going to happen. So we're beyond predicting rain. We're going to act. And I appeal to my fellow Americans and everybody else who's watching here to act for justice, act for truth, and we'll find our way out of this dilemma.
I see. And how do you see the future of BRICS in contrast of G7?
BRICS?
Yes.
Brazil, Russia? Yeah.
China,
Russia, indeed, yeah. Well, I think the future is clearly with BRICS, with everybody and his brother wanting to join. Iran, Saudi Arabia. I mean, the thing is gaining stature, and it's really a product of the insensitivity of what I called before the lily white West, because there's no need to drive other peoples together if you avoid acting arrogantly. So I think the future is with the Belt and Road Initiative and the BRICS and the other Shanghai groups and so forth that have really siphoned off the interest on the part of very important countries. And so I think that NATO has really kind of outlived its usefulness, so to speak. I think the Russians and the Chinese are still really careful about not denigrating or not completely avoiding NATO. I'm not NATO, but the UN. But they see the handwriting on the wall. It is so much a creature of the United States, so much under U.S. influence, that even the head of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, who comes to inspect that very, very large nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye in Ukraine, even when they come in there with his team and they're shelled and they need Russian protection from the shelling, and they get in a safe place and they thank the Russians for protecting it. And then somebody says, where are the shells coming from? Oh, we're not allowed to say. What do you mean? wasn't it from over there across the river? No, we're not allowed to say. Not allowed to say. My God. Of course the Ukrainians are shelling that Zeppelin. That's an incredibly dangerous thing for them to be doing. Okay? It's not just the hardened edifice there. It's the pools of this terrible runoff or waste or whatever it is that's equally dangerous. So that's a function of what the UN has become. It's become pretty much a tool in the hands of the United States. The IAEA that has to do with nuclear inspections, the chemical people who actually falsified the reports of sarin gas things and attacks in Syria. It's well known that the UN is pretty much under the heel of the Anglo-Americans, as people say. And when the Russians raise things like the dirty bomb or the laboratories, the bio-laboratories that have been set up in Ukraine, well, it's very hard for the Russians or the Chinese to get a fair hearing there, because who knows, the UK may be chairing the Security Council that day, or you could have Gabon, which has to be really, really careful not to alienate people that are giving them a lot of development money. So it's pretty corrupt. It has a usefulness still, but it's residual. The real action is gravitated toward the east, and BRICS is an excellent example of where the future lies.
I think we had, as a population of this Earth, this planet called Earth, we had enough of wars. We had Vietnam, we had Laos, we had Cambodia, we had Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and when this insanity comes to end, because I see another conflict in Taiwan. We're gonna have a serious conflict between the U.S. and China in Taiwan. How do you see this?
Well, I would relax a little bit about Taiwan. The Chinese have been around for a long time, like 5 millennia. They're careful, they're slow, they plan for the long term. They have no doubt that Taiwan will be part of China physically in the foreseeable future. In my view, the Chinese have no intention to seize Taiwan militarily. That would be not only costly, but it would be stupid. So, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that Joe Biden, President Biden, gets up and he says, if China attacks Taiwan, we're going to defend it with our boys and girls. Now, why would he say that? Well, we have midterm elections coming up here in this country, just 3 weeks away. He wants to appear really, really strong. And so it doesn't matter whether China intends to attack Taiwan anytime soon. He can really beat his breast and say, they're not going to do it on my watch. Now, the Chinese have this, I was going to say odd or weird, but it's really very sensible attitude. They keep saying, why can't we have a win-win attitude? You know?
Exactly.
I mean, not only in a moral sense, but in a political sense, why can't it be win-win? Well, it's a mystery to them why the U.S. can't accept this concept, but further proof of U.S. difficulty in accepting this concept was just 6 weeks after Biden took office. And he got up and for whatever reason said, you know, China is a developing country, but they're not going to be the most important economic power on my watch. Why not? I mean, you know, does this have to do with that exceptionalism or indispensability? Why not? You know, we had a natural trade relationship with them. So do the Russians. Why can't we just have a in the triangular sense, a win-win-win situation. Now, maybe I'll add here that I began my analyst career with the CIA a half century ago, watching relations between Russia and China. That was my job, okay? In those days, the Russians and the Chinese were at each other's throats. The total trade volume between the two countries, annual trade, was $200 million. Guess what? In 2 years, economists expect that the trade volume between the two countries will be $200 billion. Billion with a B, okay? Now, I tried to work this out. I'm not real good at math, but I worked it out so that that's 1,000 times larger. And then I checked with my mathematician sons and said, yeah, you got that right, Dad. That's 1,000 times larger. Suffice it to say that back in the 60s, even into the 70s, they were at each other's throats. We thought they would hate each other forever. Not the case. We were wrong. They saw that they could more recently band together against the United States. And when you have a common enemy that develops open strategies to make sure that each of you are in effect enemies, that is Russia and China, well, what's to prevent them from becoming very close? So bottom line here is that when I was chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch, we noticed that when Nixon went to China, the Russians started to become really, really much more friendly and flexible. Guess what happened? We got a deal on Berlin. Nobody expected them to make a deal on Berlin, but we did. And then we got arms control treaties that were the anchor of the balance for 30 years. The anti-ballistic missile treaty, which I helped with the trust but verify aspect of Doverai but Proverai. We could tell Kissinger and Nixon if the Russians cheated, and they did. Okay, we told them, and the Russians tore it down. Okay, so I was involved in that, and that was a high point in my career. They took advantage of the fact that we had gone to Beijing, and the Russians were a little afraid that the Chinese would develop a more amicable relationship with the United States at their expense. So we had, see if I can do this, we had a sort of equilateral triangle, right? It's become a isosceles triangle, if you remember your geometry, okay? The U.S. is at the short end. This is the U.S., right? These two powers have combined together so that it's not equilateral anymore. They are in tune, facing what they conceive as a common threat. And they don't have to get this from spies. They can read it in strategic documents like the one just put out by the Pentagon. So, you know, talk about insane. Why policymakers in the United States would drive these two giants together and have to face both of them. Well, talk about bipolar. They need to see a psychiatrist, and sooner the better, because it doesn't make any sense. And as the Chinese used to say back in the day, it's going to come to a no good end, the United States.
I understand. And I think I already asked all my questions. Here, if you want to add more comments on the Ukraine war or any other thing, feel free to do that.
Well, the Ukraine war, of course, is first and foremost in our concerns. We have the midterm elections coming up on the 8th of November. Only then will we be able to analyze what the winners are likely to do. And it's really hard to do this in the hypothetical, but let's say that there was a prevailing sentiment that this was a really bad idea to give billions of money to the Ukrainians when we need that money at home. Let's say there's a new reluctance on the part of Congress to keep throwing this money unregulated, unmonitored into the black hole of Ukraine. Well, that's going to have an effect. And maybe, just maybe, and this is more hope than expectation, Biden, to the degree he is able, will see the handwriting on the wall and start to act like the statesman, like Khrushchev did exactly 60 years ago, okay? Now, what does a statesman do? Well, he says, well, challenging Russia in Ukraine was a gambit. We thought it would work. Looks like the Russians are very serious and they're threatening a real wider war. Didn't work. Why don't we pull back? Why don't we reassess and pull back? Because after all, this is not an existential threat for the United States. It's becoming a real threat to Europe because they don't have the gas that they need or the oil that they need. So let's reassess this thing before things go completely out of kilter, before there's no respite for this. Now, that's my hope, as I say, and that would be the smart thing to do, because as people probably should know, my opinion on these things, Russia is winning the ground war in Ukraine. Russia cannot afford to lose the ground war in Ukraine. The small Ukrainian advances over the last month are incremental and don't matter much. The Russians are building up for a major offensive in November, December. Are they capable of doing that? They are. What will happen? Well, if Biden is smart, or if whoever is running the show there is smart, says, okay, we did this gambit, it didn't work, let's talk. Even 30 congressmen said, let's talk before they change their mind, okay? It's sensible to talk. What Khrushchev and Kennedy did is they talked, okay? They had to use a hotline, a teletype machine, and it took a while, but they talked, okay? They exchanged messages. And the message that came in exactly 60 years ago today from Khrushchev said, okay, we're withdrawing the missiles, we're packaging them up, we're putting them in crates, we're getting them on ships, we're getting them out of there, but you promised not to invade Cuba, right? And Obama said, yeah, I won't. And there was that Turkish little thing on the side, and there was a measure of trust there. In other words, some of the documents show that Khrushchev was a little worried. He said, can I trust this guy Kennedy? Now, I'm going to be quiet about it publicly, but I'm going to tell my generals that that Kennedy agreed to pull out the missiles from Turkey. Can I trust him? He won't write it down. Can I trust him? Well, he did. And Kennedy made good on that promise. There was political reasons why he didn't want to announce it just then, 60 years ago. Where is trust now? Trust is lacking. Communication is lacking. And that's why, I really worry. Sensible people would not go up to the brink and risk nuclear war. What we have in Washington are people who don't demonstrate a lot of good sense. And worse still, Putin knows that. So do his generals. And so it is a situation fully as dangerous as Cuba 60 years ago, but there are factors for stability, communications channels experience with war and a modicum of trust that existed then does not exist now. So maybe those of you who, like me, are praying types can put that into play. But the big deal that we can do on a practical scale is to spread the truth around, make sure that our leaders know that they can't put their trust in U.S. media. The media is part of the Mickey Mat, remember? Okay? What they can put their trust in is people like myself and my friends and the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity. And my son, who runs my website, always tells me, Dad, never forget in an interview like this, don't forget to mention our website, will you? Okay? And so I will. It's raymcgovern.com. Real easy, raymcgovern.com. Oh, Joseph, my son, also says, Dad, when you say that, always say, quote, if you don't get it, you don't get it, end quote. Now, I'm too modest. I'm too humble to say that. So I'm not going to say, if you don't get it, you don't get it. But it really would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.